University of Calgary. My presentation's on it's more of a practical presentation, I think, than theoretical or a general presentation on accreditation. What we're looking at is how we have tackled outcomes-based assessment at the University of Calgary. My co-authors are here as well, Bill Rosehart from the University of Calgary and Ron Hugo at the back there. So let me just start out with a brief outline of how we're looking at this. And maybe I should just say a couple words before I start here. What's happening in Canada with our accreditation boards is we have had an accreditation requirement for a long time in Canada, but just recently, and I believe it was around 2005, I'm looking at Rick because he might correct me, officially in 2008, they changed the accreditation requirements where we're now moving towards an outcomes-based assessment type of approach, similar to what you have at ABET. So a lot of us in Canadian universities are struggling with this. We're aware of these processes, but still wondering how we're going to go about doing this. So really, what this paper is on is what we found at the University of Calgary, being an institution that has been involved with the CDIO, that the CDIO has actually really helped us a lot with all of the planning resources that we need to get our plan underway at the University of Calgary. Another note is that the way our accreditation board is looking at this is we're required to show progress in this area, to show that we have a plan in place, a system in place for doing outcomes-based assessment, or in the Canadian context, what we call graduate attributes assessment, but we're not actually assessed on this until our next accreditation cycle. So that really begins in 2014. So for my talk here, what I want to do is just give a little introduction to graduate attributes assessment in Canada, graduate attribute planning, and CDIO syllabus. So what I'll do is really focus on, I guess you could call it a case study of our mechanical engineering program and how we went about doing this. The general plan applies to our entire faculty, but I'll focus on mechanical for the presentation. And then a little bit on continuous improvement, which of course is a key aspect of all of this. So I already talked a little bit about the accreditation requirement in Canada. In Canada, rather than ABET, we have the CEAB, which stands for the Canadian Engineering Accreditation Board. And as I mentioned, this has been relatively new for us. I guess the big difference here in terms of wording is, rather than talking about student outcomes, I believe that's a term that's used in ABET, we're talking about graduate attributes, but they're basically equivalent terms. This is the list of graduate attributes that has been developed. We have 12 different graduate attributes. Some of them are what you would call professional type skills, communication, teamwork, etc. Others focus on more technical types of skills, like a knowledge base for engineering, problem analysis, investigation, etc. I haven't looked at the ABET ones in a little while, but I think there are a lot of parallels between the two different sets. So this is a general process that we're following at the University of Calgary. It looks, or I've actually made a conscious effort to try to make this look a lot like a typical assessment planning process that you would see for this type of work. So just really quickly to go over it, we have the graduate attributes, which you can think of like student outcomes through the ABET context. What we end up doing is first trying to refine those graduate attributes in something that we can actually collect evidence on and assess. So the CEAB uses the term indicators. I've heard the use of the word performance indicators as well, or assessment criteria. We need to do a course mapping, or identify in the curriculum where these attributes and where the performance indicators can be assessed, and where we're teaching them in the program. Of course, assessment of those indicators and evaluation. Everything is linked to a continuous improvement and feedback process. So along the way, we're doing feedback and assessment on how we do assessments, whether we have the right mappings, whether we have the right indicators, but also the outcomes of our assessments, whether we're meeting our targets, and if improvements need to be made to the curriculum. As I mentioned, we found that the CDIO approach, or in particular just using the CDIO syllabus, has really helped us a lot with structuring all of this. So really what we've done here is we've used the CDIO syllabus itself to try to link up with our process. So for example, when we talk about graduate attributes, we can think about student outcomes or think about a higher level of the CDIO syllabus. And when we talk about performance indicators as well, that can feed out from the more detailed levels of the CDIO syllabus. This part here, I'll spend a tiny bit of time on, but Ron Hugo and Rick and Guy Coutier from École Polytechnique have done a lot of work on this, and Rick will talk a bit about that whole mapping between the CDIO syllabus and our graduate attributes in Canada. We've also used something called an introduce, teach, utilize analysis. I think people here might be familiar with that. It was, I believe, developed by somebody through the CDIO to do the basic mapping between the CDIO syllabus and our courses. And then through Rick and Ron's mapping and Guy's mapping, we could then map that directly to our attributes. So that's a general process we're following. The way I view this, and sorry, I may be using the wrong level numbers here, but if you're familiar with the CDIO syllabus, you'll notice that it starts at a relatively high level of abstraction and moves down to more detailed, what I view as really learning outcomes. If you read the lowest level of the CDIO syllabus, they look like what could be a course learning outcome, for example. So with these next slides, I'll just show how we've interpreted that and how it's helped us with the way we've structured the curriculum or the learning outcomes, I should say, for our mechanical program. So for example, at the top level, well, I should just describe this quickly first. So level 1, or the top level of the CDIO syllabus, we look at in terms of high-level program educational objectives. That's something that the Canadian Engineering Accreditation Board really hasn't asked us to look at. I think in ABET we do have to set program educational objectives, but we thought as part of this it would be useful from a strategic point of view to do that for mechanical engineering as well. Second level really maps to the graduate attributes, and I'll show you that in a minute in an example. And the third level would be intended learning outcomes or performance indicators. So here's an example. For mechanical engineering, there is a version 2 of the syllabus right now, so I might have changed the wording a little bit, but you get an idea here. One of the CDIO level 1 notes is technical knowledge and reasoning. So for mechanical engineering, we can just rephrase that as we want our students to demonstrate a deep understanding of or knowledge of technical fundamentals, for example. And similarly with these other ones. So for example, interpersonal skills, teamwork, communication, we want our students to be able to communicate effectively and work in multidisciplinary teams. So there's the real link between the two areas there. Working down a level, right here I'm just looking at that one area of personal and professional skills and attributes. Going down in the levels of the syllabus, we have engineering reasoning and problem solving. So we want our students to be able to analyze and solve engineering problems, for example. So it's basically just duplicated, rephrased based on discussions with our stakeholders on how this should be phrased for the mechanical program, but really use the CDIO syllabus as a basis for how we identify this work. This slide is almost impossible for you to read, and I apologize for that, but hopefully Rick will be able to clarify all of this. What I've done is really duplicate the work that they've done, and you'll hear, I think, in the next paper, but just showing it in the context of mechanical engineering. So what we have here is the 12 attributes that I showed you earlier in the slides, the 12 CEAB graduate attributes. Along here is really the CDIO syllabus, but just reinterpreted slightly to the context of the Bachelor of Science in Engineering or in Mechanical Engineering at the University of Calgary. So these are our high-level program educational objectives and then student outcomes. And this is the mapping between the two. So we can go right from the CDIO syllabus directly to a mapping of the CDIB graduate attributes and then build our assessment process around that. The benefits that we see of the approach, well, for one, for the mechanical program at the University of Calgary, we've been working with the CDIO for a number of years and are very much a CDIO department. As a result, we can still do that work and tie it into all of this accreditation work. So in a way, we're just building our own objectives, our own learning outcomes, and then linking them right back to the CAB. So it fits really nicely with an onerous accreditation process with what we're doing already anyway in terms of our curriculum. A really big benefit here, I didn't really talk about this too much already, but our next accreditation visit is actually occurring this fall. It's happening in November, so we've really been scrambling to get this together. The process of developing all of these learning outcomes, key indicators or performance indicators for CEAD graduate attributes is a lot of work. And this process I'm describing, it helped us really get started. At least we have a plan in place, and now we're going to go back and look at all of these indicators, look at how we're doing assessments as part of this feedback improvement cycle, and refine it a bit, but it certainly has made it that we didn't have to start from scratch. We could really build on something that we're already working on. I just wanted to show you a few examples. This is an example here of the design graduate attribute. This is these are probably a little bit out of date, but this is sort of the lowest level of the CDIO syllabus. And based on this mapping that will be discussed in the next paper, we can identify what I'll call CDIO learning outcomes at the lowest level of the syllabus. And then based on the ITU interviews that we conducted, we would meet with instructors, typically an hour meeting, talk about the course, talk about the CDIO syllabus. They'd identify which learning outcomes they feel like introduce, teach, or utilize in their course, and even discuss the nature of those learning outcomes. We might actually modify them a bit based on the way we actually do things at the University of Calgary. So this is an example of that with the course mappings. It's a lot of indicators, so we spend a heck of a lot of time assessing every one of those that you have in the CDIO syllabus. What we've done is based on our interviews, based on just meetings within the department, the faculty, and eventually we'll be doing expanding the number of stakeholders to students, industry, etc. We've reduced that list of indicators. We have a more reasonable assessment plan. So for example, of that big list that I showed you, that's actually even longer. I think I just showed you page 1. We've reduced this to just 8 indicators that we're assessing for the design graduate attribute. This is actually a long one. A lot of them just have 4 or 6 indicators that we're assessing for a particular graduate attribute. So for example, one learning outcome or indicator that we want to assess and collect evidence on is our students should be able to elicit and interpret customer needs, or they should be able to use prototypes to test articles in the design environment. So those are things that we can really collect evidence on within a course, within a design project, for example, set a target for performance levels and report back on that. One thing that we're looking at here for our process is using a more staged approach to graduate attribute assessment. Rather than assessing all 12 graduate attributes every year, we felt it made more sense to do 4 per year. The idea here is with this diagram, what we're showing is each of the 12 graduate attributes, different academic years. Every year we're doing indirect assessments of all 12 graduate attributes through surveys and that sort of thing. But direct assessments in courses, for example, last year we just assessed design, individual and teamwork, communication skills, and the impact of engineering on society and the environment. So 4 of the graduate attributes. The rationale behind that is that it's a little less onerous for our faculty in terms of the number of assessments that occur, but also in terms of the entire continuous improvement process. We felt that by tackling smaller pieces, we can actually achieve something within our curriculum review. If we're trying to juggle too many balls in the air at once and look at all 12 graduate attributes every year and trying to make changes, we were worried that might not be practical. So this is the approach that we're proposing. We'll see what the accreditation board thinks of that. typically, an accreditation cycle, if we're successful, is about 6 years in Canada. So what would happen with this type of plan is you have at least 2 direct assessments of every graduate attribute, and you'd be able to show some improvement over one accreditation cycle. If we found one of them had real problems, we certainly would assess it more frequently. But right now, starting out, this is what we're looking at in terms of number of assessments. So for each indicator, what we're doing, as I mentioned, we have both direct and indirect assessments. So we're assessing directly in courses. So this would fall back on that course mapping that I showed you earlier that we did using the ITU analysis. And we'd be doing direct assessments, maybe using rubrics to assess something in a design course or an exam score or something like that. And we'd be looking at just those 4 graduate attributes each year. We also do indirect assessments. So what we've looked at so far in terms of indirect assessments are exit surveys of our students. They're really self-efficacy type surveys. Same thing for alumni 1 year out. So really a self-efficacy as well. How well do you, or how confident do you feel in your ability to do X, for example. And direct assessments via employer surveys. And right now, to be completely candid, the way we've set this up, it's a little bit of a shotgun approach in terms of going out to employers, but we're setting up a plan to be a little more targeted in terms of making sure we get the questions out to the right employers, we can get a good assessment of our student abilities. This is just an example. This is not in the paper, but the approach we've been using for direct assessment in courses is to use something called a reflective memo. Effectively, what we've done, for example, in our capstone design course, is asked our instructors to put together a reflective memo for the course. And if you're not familiar with reflective memo, the basic structure is to say, what are the learning outcomes for the course? So in this case, we would have those indicators in there for design for the graduate attributes. How do you plan to actually go about teaching those and assessing those in your course? And how did your students do in terms of those assessments? So this is showing that the capstone course from last year, showing those 8 indicators. Remember, I showed you a slide that showed 8 indicators that we set for the graduate attribute design and our performance. And the rubric that we used had levels not yet competent, competent, and sophisticated. So we basically set up a histogram. So for the first performance indicator, which was elicit and interpret customer needs, we identified a piece of evidence in the course, which happened to be a design review, where students were required to describe customer needs, their interpretation of their customer needs, based on interviews with industry partners, etc. And based on the assessment in that rubric, you can see the students seem to do very well. The second one, we didn't actually have any evidence for that, for direct assessment, but the other 7 did. Here's another example. This is one of the indirect assessments. And as I mentioned, for indirect assessments, we've assessed all 12 graduate attributes. So this here, again, just shows proportion of students, all 12 graduate attributes. The survey that we used, I'm going to redesign this. I think it had too many categories, but remember I mentioned there were self-efficacy surveys, and effectively what we're asking students is how do you rate your competence in a certain area? How confident are you? Are you 0% or not confident at all, up to 100% confidence? So we had 4 different levels. Is that right? No, 5 different levels there. And you can see the performance in each of the graduate attributes. So this is design. So basic idea is that with direct assessments, 3 different indirect assessments, we have a little bit of a triangulation going on there. Hopefully we have some consistency in the results that we see. If one performance indicator is not as good as we would have liked, hopefully we see that same kind of performance in the other assessments, so we're a little more confident that we can actually make a statement, for example, that our students need more work and teamwork, for example. So we're in the evaluation continuous improvement phase right now of that first slide that I showed you. We've actually done some evaluation, or definitely some data collection, starting evaluation of those first 4 graduate attributes from 2010, 2011. But really, we're still collecting data. I would almost argue that we're at the stage right now where the type of feedback and improvements that we'll be making will be more to the assessment system. So we'll be looking at better ways of assessing our students to be more confident in the results, making sure that performance indicators are right and all of that. It'll probably be a few more years before we get to the point where we can say, oh, we have to make that change in a particular course to improve this particular outcome. But we're still in that process. I think we're fairly well aligned to at least get on track here to do this work. So quick summary. I guess this first line is not really an advertisement for the CDIO, but you don't really need to fully adopt the CDIO to do this. But you certainly can, as a Canadian institution, take advantage of the CDIO syllabus. I would argue it certainly helps to be engaged in CDIO, and probably if you're doing this, you would become engaged once you see the work of the CDIO. The syllabus itself, effectively, the way I view it anyway, effectively a very detailed list of outcomes that we can use to help us with this assessment work, and can save considerable times in terms of the identification of indicators, at least the initial starting ones, the mapping of the curriculum, etc. Okay. So thank you, and open up for questions. So I think we have a few minutes for questions if I have any. Yes, Brooke?